January 30th, 1947, 2:15 p.m., Oxbow, Saskatchewan. The classroom windows framed an afternoon that felt like early spring. Water pooled in the streets. Students sat in shirt sleeves, watching the thaw run down the gutters. It had been a mild winter, unusually gentle, and the warm afternoon promised an early end to the cold season. Then came the knock on the door. The teacher stepped into the hallway. When she returned, her face had changed. The students would later remember that look. Not panic. Something worse. Recognition. "You're dismissed," she said. "Go, straight home. Tell your parents a severe storm is coming." They walked home in shirt sleeves, nearly 2 miles through streets puddled with meltwater. Parents met them at doors with puzzled expressions. School was rarely dismissed early, and on such a beautiful day. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees. The storm that began that Thursday evening would not truly end for 10 days. When it finally released its grip on the Canadian prairies, it would leave behind a landscape transformed. Towns buried to their rooftops, telephone poles visible only as dark points above an ocean of white. And trains connected prairie settlements to the rest of the nation, entombed in snowdrifts so massive that even the plows sent to rescue them became prisoners themselves. The Canadian Pacific Railway's Snowplow sat buried off the western edge of Oxbow for 3 days, waiting for the mainline plow to arrive and dig it free from its cold white grave. Saskatchewan in 1947 depended on trains the way a body depends on blood. Every town along the Canadian Pacific and Canadian National lines existed because the railway had put it there. Grain moved on trains. Coal arrived on trains. Mail, medicine, machinery, everything that kept prairie life running traveled those ribbons of steel stretching from Winnipeg to Calgary. The system had survived blizzards before. Prairie winters were brutal by design, and the railways had developed strategies to match them. Massive rotary snowplows with spinning blades that could chew through drifts. Telegraph systems to coordinate movements and warn of closures. Engineers who knew every mile of track, every cut where snow gathered, every stretch of open prairie where wind built walls of white. But what arrived on January 30th exceeded all calculations. The snow fell. Silently at first, steady and thick, accumulating at rates that seemed impossible. 3 inches an hour, then 5. The wind picked up after midnight, screaming across the flat prairie with nothing to slow it, gathering the falling snow and redistributing it according to laws only chaos understood. By dawn on January 31st, the Canadian National Railway train, approaching Weyburn, faced drifts that towered above the locomotive. The engineer slowed, then stopped. The train sat motionless on the tracks, snow piling against it with such speed that by afternoon only the top of the engine remained visible. The crew stayed inside, burning coal to keep the passenger cars warm, waiting for rescue that couldn't come because every rescue vehicle sent toward them suffered the same fate. Photographs from that week show surreal images. A full-length passenger train reduced to a series of dark humps in an otherwise featureless white expanse. Men with shovels standing atop what should have been 15 feet of empty air, digging downward toward steel they couldn't see. The scale defied comprehension. These weren't snowdrifts, they were geological features created in hours instead of millennia. On February 3rd, Regina's thermometers registered negative 60 degrees Celsius, a North American record that still stands. The temperature arrived during the height of the blizzard, creating conditions so hostile that exposed skin froze in seconds, breath crystallized before it could dissipate, and steel became brittle as glass. All highways leading into and out of the capital closed. They would remain closed for 10 days. In Moose Jaw, a dairy farmer woke to discover his two-story barn completely buried. Only a small section of roof remained visible above the snow line. The doors were useless. 12 feet of compacted snow and ice blocked them completely. He climbed onto the roof with an axe and a saw, cut a hole through the shingles and the planking beneath, lowered himself down into the darkness where his animals waited, their warm breath rising in clouds of steam. Twice daily for a week he repeated this descent, milking his cows through a hole in his own barn's roof. The story spread through Moose Jaw and beyond, becoming a kind of folklore, a benchmark against which other storm hardships could be measured. But it was far from unique. Across southern Saskatchewan, isolation took forms both practical and profound. In Regina, 100 carloads of coal sat stranded on sidings, visible but unreachable. The city's furnaces burned their reserves, while fuel sat frozen 300 yards away. People tried to reach the trains by sleigh, the only vehicle that could move through the drifts, but the wind proved stronger than horses. The sleighs turned back. Municipal power plants rationed electricity with dim-outs, scheduled reductions that left homes and businesses in twilight, conserving coal that couldn't be replaced. Schools closed for lack of fuel. Butchers sold the last of their meat by Tuesday. By Wednesday, butter and yeast had disappeared from store shelves completely. Bread became a matter of improvisation, recipes passed door to door, substitutions invented out of necessity. In some communities, only the tops of telephone poles marked where streets had been. People dug tunnels through the snow, connecting houses to sheds, sheds to neighbors, creating a network of passages beneath the surface. They emerged periodically into the howling white above, checked their bearings, then descended again into the relative quiet of their slow warren. The draymen in Oxbow, men with teams and sleighs who normally hauled goods short distances, became emergency services. They carried coal from the school basement, which had been stopped heavily just weeks before the storm, delivering it to the hospital as supplies ran low. Neighbor helped neighbor. Commerce became cooperation. The storm stripped away normal transactions and left something more primitive and necessary. On the trapped trains, time moved differently. Passengers and crew burned coal to stay warm, rationing carefully, never certain when rescue would arrive or if it would arrive at all. The cars remained heated, but supplies dwindled. Food that was meant to last from Winnipeg to Moose Jaw had to stretch across days of immobility. Dining cars inventoried their stores, distributed meals in careful portions, made coffee last. Windows became walls of white, snow pressed so tight against the glass that no light penetrated. Inside the cars, oil lamps flickered. Outside, the wind screamed without pause, a sound so constant it became silence's opposite, a presence that filled the ears until nothing else could enter. Communication with the outside world depended on telegraph lines that survived the storm. Not all did. The weight of ice and the force of wind brought down poles across hundreds of miles. Where lines remained intact, messages crawled slowly along the network. Reports of conditions, requests for assistance, updates on rescue efforts that stalled, regrouped, tried new routes, and stalled again. The Canadian Pacific Railway and Canadian National Railway coordinated their largest winter rescue operation in history. Snowplows were dispatched from both directions, east and west, working toward the stranded trains. But the plows themselves became victims. One after another, the massive machines ground to stops in drifts too deep and too dense to penetrate. Crews aboard the plows found themselves in the same situation as those they'd been sent to rescue, trapped, burning coal, waiting. Near Weyburn, rescuers finally reached the buried CNR train on February 9th, 11 days after the storm began. They brought fresh supplies, fuel, and most importantly, a way forward. Not by clearing the tracks, that would take weeks, but by evacuating passengers and crew over land using tracked vehicles that could climb over drifts instead of cutting through them. The photographs from that rescue show men standing on top of boxcars that looked like icebergs, shoveling downward, creating access points. Others worked at ground level, their bodies invisible except for the tops of their heads and their shovels arcing up and down, moving snow one blade at a time. The blizzard ended on February 8th, but Saskatchewan remained paralyzed for weeks after. Some railway lines stayed blocked until spring thaw made them passable. Roads in the southwest remained impassable for months. Communities that had been isolated during the storm's height stayed isolated long after the wind stopped and the sky cleared. When trains finally began moving again, they traveled through a transformed landscape. The snow had redistributed everything. Familiar landmarks had vanished or shifted. Cuts that normally gathered drifts had been scoured clean, while open stretches showed mountains of white that hadn't existed before. The economic impact rippled outward. Grain that couldn't reach markets, livestock that couldn't reach slaughterhouses, coal that couldn't reach furnaces. Every delay cascaded into other delays, a domino effect of frozen commerce that took months to resolve. But what lingered longest wasn't the economic disruption or the physical damage. It was the memory of vulnerability. Saskatchewan's towns existed because technology had made them possible. The railway connected them. Telegraph lines linked them. Mechanical progress had conquered distance and turned hostile prairie into productive farmland. The storm revealed how thin that conquest remained. 10 days without trains, and civilization's veneer cracked open. 10 days, and coal piles dwindled to nothing. 10 days, and bread became scarce in communities surrounded by wheat fields that produced millions of bushels annually. The buried trains became symbols, not of failure exactly, but of limits. The machines that had seemed invincible, these massive locomotives that could haul entire towns' worth of goods across a continent, sat helpless beneath snow driven by wind. All the engineering expertise, all the organizational sophistication, all the industrial might of a modern nation could not overcome the simple physics of frozen water falling from the sky. Environment Canada later designated the event Worst Storm in Canadian Railroad History. The title was accurate, but insufficient. It was the worst storm because railways mattered most. Because without them, the prairie settlements discovered how precarious their existence truly was. The schoolchildren who walked home in shirt sleeves on that warm January afternoon, wondering at their early dismissal, would remember the moment differently decades later. Not as the day a storm began, but as the last moment of a kind of innocence. The last afternoon before they learned that warmth could vanish in hours, that connections could break, that the systems they depended on were fragile in ways no one wanted to acknowledge until fragility became undeniable. The trains eventually ran again. The snow melted. Spring came. Life resumed its patterns. But those who lived through January 1947 never quite forgot what they'd seen. Their entire world buried, their machines defeated, their communities isolated, not by miles, but by feet of snow and degrees below zero. They'd survived, certainly. People died. Hypothermia took some who attempted to travel, but most endured through improvisation, cooperation, and the simple, stubborn refusal to surrender. The trains sat buried for days or weeks, massive metal monuments to human ambition, rendered temporarily irrelevant by weather. Then shovels reached them. Plows freed them, and they moved again, carrying grain and coal and passengers, as they always had, as they always would. Until they didn't. until the next storm proved even the lessons learned could be forgotten, or until the next impossibility arrived and turned possibility into memory.